Sarah's hands moved in graceful patterns through the dusty air, but nobody watched, nobody understood. In the sweltering heat of that August day in 1883, the marketplace buzzed with the sounds of commerce, cattle lowing, chickens squawking, merchants hawking their wares. But Sarah existed in a world of profound silence. She had been born this way, entering the world without the gift of hearing, though her eyes sparkled with an intelligence that most people overlooked in their haste to categorize her as defective. Her father, once a proud man who'd owned a successful feed store, now stood hunched with desperation and shame. The bank had foreclosed on his business 3 months earlier, and creditors circled like vultures. His wife had died giving birth to Sarah 18 years ago, and he'd struggled alone to raise a daughter he didn't understand in a world that offered no patience for differences. "She can't hear nothing, but she works hard," he shouted over the chaos of merchants and livestock, his voice cracking with the weight of what he was about to do. "Perfect for kitchen work or cleaning. Won't talk back neither, seeing as she can't speak proper." The crowd that gathered around them represented the worst of human nature. People who found entertainment in others' misfortune, who measured worth by what someone could produce rather than who they were as a person. Sarah had learned early to read the subtle expressions that crossed people's faces when they looked at her. There was the quick flicker of fear, as if deafness might be contagious, the condescending head tilts that suggested she might be simple-minded as well as deaf, the calculating looks of those wondering how they might exploit someone who couldn't hear danger approaching. But what hurt most was the complete dismissal. The way people's eyes would slide past her as if she were furniture, rather than a human being with thoughts, feelings, and dreams of her own. She had dreams, despite what the world told her about girls like herself. She dreamed of having conversations that lasted hours, of being understood, of finding someone who would take the time to learn that her silence was not emptiness, but simply a different way of experiencing the world. Her father had been a blacksmith once, respected in their small Texas town until whiskey became his closest companion and debt his constant shadow. Now he stood selling his only daughter like she was surplus equipment, desperate for coins to settle what he owed the bank. "She's 18, strong as an ox, and she won't be causing no trouble with idle chatter," he continued, his voice carrying the bitter edge of a man who'd run out of options. Sarah remembered learning to read lips as a child, watching her mother's gentle mouth form words of love before illness took her away. She remembered the silence that followed, not just the absence of sound, but the absence of anyone who cared enough to learn her language. Her father had tried briefly, but frustration won over patience, and soon he stopped trying altogether. Jake Morrison had been in town that day purely by coincidence, having come to purchase supplies for his ranch and sell a few head of cattle. He'd built his spread from nothing over the past 15 years, working land that others said was too rough, too remote, too challenging for successful ranching. But Jake had learned early in life that the things worth having rarely came easy, and he'd developed both the patience and determination necessary to see difficult projects through to completion. He'd been a different man when he first arrived in Texas. Younger, angrier, carrying wounds from the war that had taken 3 years of his life and most of his faith in human decency. The frontier had a way of either breaking men or remaking them, and Jake had chosen the harder path of rebuilding himself from the ground up. He'd learned that real strength came not from dominating others, but from protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. His own children had taught him that love was something you chose to give, not something you demanded in return. When he heard Sarah's father auctioning her off like livestock, something cold and hard settled in Jake's chest. He'd seen too much cruelty in his lifetime, during the war, on cattle drives, in boom towns where might made right and the vulnerable were consumed by the strong. But this felt different, more personal somehow. Maybe it was the way the girl held herself with dignity despite her circumstances. Or maybe it was the complete absence of hope in her father's voice as he reduced his own child to a commodity. Jake Morrison didn't speak immediately. He stood studying Sarah with eyes that held neither pity nor disgust, just careful assessment. When he finally reached into his vest and pulled out a roll of bills, the crowd stirred with interest. He counted out the money slowly, placing each note on the auctioneer's table with quiet dignity. "That'll do," Sarah's father said quickly, eager to complete the transaction before anyone changed their mind. "She's yours now, mister. Just remember, no refunds for damaged goods." Jake's jaw tightened at those words, but he kept his response measured. "She ain't damaged," he said, his voice carrying authority despite its softness. "She's just different." He turned to Sarah then, removing his hat in a gesture of respect that surprised everyone present. With deliberate movements, he placed his hand over his heart and nodded to her, a universal sign of greeting and good intention. Sarah's eyes widened. This stranger, this cowboy who'd just purchased her like livestock, was trying to communicate with her in the only way he knew how. She mimicked his gesture, hand over heart, and for the first time that day, something resembling hope flickered in her chest. Jake led her to his wagon without looking back at the dispersing crowd. He helped her up to the seat beside him, not behind like cargo, and handed her the reins. When she looked at him questioningly, he pointed to himself, then to her, then to the horses, making it clear they would share the responsibility of getting home. As they rode out of town, Sarah caught glimpses of Jake from the corner of her eye. His hands moved constantly, pointing out landmarks, gesturing to birds overhead, touching his chest when he spoke his name. "Jake," she lip-read as he repeated it slowly. She pointed to herself and mouthed, "Sarah," pleased when understanding lit his features. Their destination was a ranch that sprawled across rolling hills, dotted with oak trees and crossed by a clear running creek. Buildings spread out from a central farmhouse, barns, corrals and bunkhouses that spoke of prosperity earned through honest work. But what caught Sarah's attention immediately were the children. 5 of them emerged from various hiding spots as the wagon approached, ranging in age from perhaps 6 to 16. They moved with the curiosity of young ones, but kept their distance, uncertain about this newcomer their father had brought home. Jake climbed down and gathered them around him, his hands moving as he spoke to explain Sarah's presence. What happened next would stay with Sarah forever. Jake knelt in the dirt and began drawing letters with his finger, spelling out words while speaking them aloud. The children watched intently as he demonstrated simple signs, pointing to his eyes for see, touching his ears for hear, placing his hands over his mouth for speak. Then he pointed to Sarah and shook his head gently, showing them that she experienced the world differently. "She talks with her hands," the eldest boy said, his voice filled with wonder rather than mockery. "Like the Cheyenne traders who come through sometimes." Jake nodded encouragingly. "That's right, Samuel, and we're going to learn her language so she feels welcome here." He stood and faced Sarah, his expression serious but kind. "This is your home now if you want it to be. Nobody here's gonna treat you like you're less than whole." Sarah felt tears threatening as she watched this rough cowboy patiently explain sign language basics to his children. She'd never seen hearing people make such an effort to bridge the gap between her world and theirs. Most folks treated her deafness like a contagious disease or a divine punishment, something to be avoided or pitied, but never understood. Jake showed her to a small but comfortable room in the main house, its window overlooking the valley where horses grazed peacefully. He'd prepared it with feminine touches, a quilt on the bed, wildflowers in a mason jar, a small mirror on the dresser. These weren't the accommodations of a servant, but of a family member. During those early weeks at the ranch, Sarah discovered layers to Jake Morrison that surprised her daily. She'd expected kindness to be temporary, a brief show of charity that would fade once the novelty wore off. Instead, she found a man whose actions consistently matched his words, whose patience seemed inexhaustible when it came to bridging the communication gap between them. He had an old army trunk in his study filled with books, maps, and journals from his travels. Sarah learned that he'd been educated back east before the war, that he'd once considered becoming a teacher before circumstances led him west. This background explained his methodical approach to learning sign language, the way he took careful notes and practiced consistently rather than expecting immediate results. The children's acceptance of Sarah revealed the quality of Jake's parenting. They had been raised to see people as individuals rather than collections of limitations or differences. When 8-year-old Michael asked why Sarah couldn't hear, Jake explained deafness the same way he might explain why some horses were brown and others black, as simply another variation in God's creation, neither better nor worse than any other. But it was during a violent thunderstorm in October that Sarah truly understood what kind of man Jake Morrison was. She woke in the middle of the night to find the house shaking with wind and rain pounding against the windows like gunshots. The children were frightened, crying for comfort she couldn't provide with words. Jake found her in the main room, trying desperately to calm 5 scared children, using only gestures and touch. Without hesitation, he knelt beside her and began signing the lullaby he'd been learning, his large hands moving slowly through the familiar patterns while he hummed the melody aloud for the children who could hear it. The sight of their strong, capable father speaking in Sarah's language while holding baby David close to his chest was something none of them would ever forget. In that moment, Sarah realized that Jake hadn't just learned sign language to communicate with her. He'd embraced it as part of their family's identity. The transformation of Sarah's daily existence began with small revelations that accumulated into something extraordinary. In her previous life, mornings had been exercises in careful navigation, reading her father's mood through his posture and facial expressions, anticipating his needs before he grew frustrated with having to communicate them to someone he considered defective. She had learned to make herself invisible, useful but unnoticed, valuable enough to keep around, but never important enough to truly consider. At the Morrison Ranch, mornings became celebrations of possibility. Jake would rise before dawn to start the coffee and check on the livestock, but he always returned to the house in time to share breakfast with his family. Sarah discovered that he had rearranged his entire routine to accommodate family meals, something that amazed her given the demanding nature of ranch work. These breakfast gatherings became Sarah's first real experience with family conversation. The children chatted about their plans for the day, their dreams, their fears, their observations about everything from cloud formations to the behavior of the barn cats. Jake listened to each child with the same serious attention, asking questions that showed he valued their thoughts and opinions. When Sarah began tentatively sharing her own observations about weather patterns she'd noticed, improvements she envisioned for the garden, techniques she wanted to try with the horses, Jake responded with the same respectful attention he gave his biological children. The realization that her thoughts mattered, that someone actually wanted to hear her perspective on things beyond basic household tasks, was revolutionary for Sarah. She had ideas about everything: more efficient ways to organize the barn, methods for extending the growing season in their vegetable garden, approaches to training horses that built on their natural behaviors rather than fighting against them. For the first time in her life, she had an audience that encouraged her to voice these ideas and helped her implement them. The true transformation in Sarah's life came gradually, built through thousands of small moments of acceptance and understanding. Jake established routines that included her naturally, rather than making her feel like an accommodation. Family meetings were conducted with both speech and sign language. Dinner conversations flowed seamlessly between the two languages, with children switching between them as naturally as breathing. Sarah's work with the horses became legendary among neighboring ranchers. Her visual acuity, heightened by years of relying on sight rather than sound, allowed her to spot behavioral changes that others missed. She could detect lameness before it became obvious, identify illness before symptoms became severe, and predict weather changes by reading subtle shifts in animal behavior. But perhaps most importantly, she developed a training technique that revolutionized how the Morrison Ranch worked with difficult horses. Instead of relying on voice commands and dominance, Sarah used visual cues, touch, and an almost mystical ability to communicate with horses on their own terms. Word spread throughout the county about the deaf woman who could gentle the wildest Mustang with nothing but patience and understanding. The success of her methods attracted visitors from as far away as San Antonio and Dallas. Ranchers came expecting to learn new training techniques and left having learned something far more valuable about the nature of communication itself. Sarah's demonstrations showed that real understanding required attention, patience, and respect rather than volume or force. These visits also served another purpose. They gradually changed how the local community viewed Sarah and, by extension, other people with disabilities. Children who had once pointed and stared began asking thoughtful questions about sign language. Adults who had dismissed deaf people as burdens discovered that Sarah contributed more to her community than many hearing people they knew. The scarlet fever epidemic that struck their valley in the autumn of 1884 became the crucible that transformed Sarah from newcomer to indispensable family member. The disease arrived with the traveling merchant's family and spread rapidly through the scattered homesteads and ranches. Medical care was limited on the frontier under the best of circumstances, but the epidemic overwhelmed the few available doctors and left families to fend for themselves. When Maria fell ill first, Sarah recognized the symptoms immediately from her childhood memories of caring for her dying mother. The distinctive rash, high fever, and difficulty swallowing marked scarlet fever as clearly as if the diagnosis had been written in large letters. Jake's face went white when Sarah signed her assessment to him, because they both knew that scarlet fever could kill children quickly and had no reliable cure. Sarah took charge of the situation with a competence that surprised even Jake. She had Maria isolated from the other children immediately, though she knew it was probably too late to prevent the disease from spreading through the household. She prepared a sick room with everything needed for extended nursing care, boiled water constantly for cleaning and steam treatments, and began the exhausting routine of round-the-clock care that would determine whether Maria lived or died. When little David developed symptoms 2 days later, followed by Michael the day after that, Sarah found herself nursing 3 critically ill children while Jake maintained the ranch operations that supported their family's survival. The physical demands were crushing. She slept in fragments, never more than an hour at a time, constantly monitoring temperatures, administering medications, forcing fluids down reluctant throats, and providing the comfort that scared children needed to fight for their lives. But it was during those long nights of crisis that Sarah discovered capabilities within herself that she had never known existed. Her deafness, which others had always viewed as a disability, became an advantage in the sick room. She could monitor the children's breathing patterns and detect changes in their condition through visual cues that hearing people might miss while distracted by other sounds. Her ability to remain calm in silence helped create a peaceful environment that aided recovery. More importantly, Sarah's experience with communication barriers had taught her to be deeply attentive to non-verbal cues. She could read pain, fear, comfort, and improvement in the children's expressions and body language with an accuracy that amazed Jake. When David was too weak to speak or even open his eyes, Sarah knew from the set of his shoulders when he was uncomfortable and needed repositioning. When Maria's fever finally broke, Sarah detected the change in her breathing pattern hours before anyone else would have noticed improvement. The epidemic lasted 6 weeks, during which time Sarah barely left the house except to gather medicinal herbs or check on neighbors who were also struggling with sick family members. She lost 15 pounds she couldn't afford to lose and developed a persistent cough from exhaustion, but she never wavered in her dedication to the children's care. Jake watched her transform from someone he was protecting into someone who was protecting his most precious possessions, and his respect for her deepened into something approaching awe. When the last child recovered fully and the danger had passed, Jake found Sarah collapsed in exhaustion in the kitchen, still trying to sterilize medical supplies even though the crisis was over. He carried her to bed despite her protests and sat vigil over her the way she had sat vigil over his children. During her recovery, the children took turns caring for her, bringing her meals, reading to her, and practicing their sign language to entertain her. The role reversal completed their transformation from strangers sharing a house to a genuine family, bound by love and mutual dependence. During those long nights of nursing sick children, Jake and Sarah developed their own intimate form of communication. He would spell words into her palm when spoken language failed them both. She would guide his hands to show him how to check for breathing or pulse. Their partnership in caring for his children created a bond deeper than mere friendship or obligation. When both children recovered fully, Jake sat Sarah down for a conversation that would change everything. Using the sign language they'd both been learning, supplemented by written notes, he explained his situation. He was a widower, struggling to raise 5 children while managing a successful ranch. He needed a partner, not a servant, and he'd come to care for Sarah in ways that surprised him. "I ain't asking you to love me," he signed carefully, his large hands moving with practiced deliberation, "but I'm asking if you'd consider staying permanent. As my wife, if you'll have me. These children need a mother, and I need someone who sees the world different than most folks do." Sarah stared at him in shock. In a society that viewed deaf people as burdens or objects of charity, this cowboy was proposing marriage based on mutual respect and genuine affection. She thought of the marketplace where her father had sold her, of all the years she'd been treated as less than human, and realized that Jake Morrison was offering her something she'd never dared dream of: true equality. Their marriage ceremony became a watershed moment for the entire community. Jake had insisted on having the service conducted in both spoken English and American Sign Language, requiring him to find a minister willing to learn enough signs to make the ceremony meaningful for Sarah. When no local clergy volunteered, Jake traveled to Austin to convince a progressive minister to make the journey to their small town. Word of the unusual wedding spread throughout the county, drawing curious onlookers alongside family and friends. Some came expecting to witness a spectacle, but they found themselves moved by something far more profound. When Jake recited his vows in sign language, his hands moving with careful precision through words of love and commitment, even the skeptics in the congregation found themselves wiping away tears. Sarah's response, delivered in clear spoken words she'd been practicing for weeks, surprised everyone who assumed she was mute as well as deaf. "I take you, Jake Morrison, to be my husband, my partner, and my voice in a world that forgot how to listen," she said, her voice carrying across the packed church with absolute clarity. "You saw my heart when others only saw my limitations." The reception that followed set a new standard for inclusive celebration in their community. Tables were arranged so that conversations could flow visually as well as audibly. Entertainment included both musical performances for the hearing guests and elaborate storytelling performances that Sarah had choreographed using movement and expression. Children who had been learning sign language from their parents performed a welcome song for Sarah, their small hands moving through the familiar patterns while their voices carried the melody. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Sarah's father, who had been watching from the back of the church, approached the couple during the reception. Tears streaming down his weathered face, he attempted his first halting signs, an apology he'd been practicing for months with help from Jake. "I'm sorry," his clumsy fingers spelled out. "I was afraid and stupid. I sold my daughter because I thought she was worth less than a cow. But you showed me she was worth more than gold." The financial challenges that came with operating a specialized school in a remote location tested both Sarah's determination and Jake's business acumen. Traditional funding sources were reluctant to support deaf education, viewing it as charity rather than investment. Sarah and Jake found themselves using ranch profits to subsidize the school, sometimes struggling to balance their family's needs with their commitment to their students. During particularly difficult years, when drought affected cattle sales and enrollment dropped due to economic hardship, they considered closing the school. But letters from former students and visits from families whose children had been transformed by Sarah's teaching always renewed their commitment. They learned to be creative with funding, establishing scholarship programs supported by sympathetic ranchers and organizing fundraising events that brought together the hearing and deaf communities. Sarah's reputation eventually attracted attention from wealthy philanthropists in eastern cities who were beginning to recognize the importance of deaf education. A substantial donation from a Boston industrialist whose own granddaughter was deaf allowed Sarah to expand the school significantly, adding dormitory facilities for students from distant areas and hiring additional teachers trained in her methods. The expansion brought new challenges as Sarah found herself managing an institution rather than simply teaching individual students. She had to learn administrative skills, financial planning, and political navigation while maintaining the personal touch that had made her school special. Jake took on increasing responsibility for the business side of the operation, allowing Sarah to focus on curriculum development and teacher training. Their partnership in building the school became a model for other educational institutions throughout the West. They demonstrated that successful programs required not just educational expertise, but also community support, financial sustainability, and political advocacy. Their approach influenced the development of deaf schools throughout Texas and the Southwest, spreading Sarah's methods far beyond their original small community. But they also brought unexpected joys. Sarah's garden became legendary in their county, her visual attention to detail and careful observation skills helping her coax vegetables from stubborn soil. She developed new techniques for training horses using visual cues and gentle touch, methods that other ranchers began copying. Most importantly, she raised Jake's children with a combination of firmness and creativity that helped them become confident, compassionate adults. The decision to establish a formal school for deaf children grew from Sarah's increasing frustration with the educational options available to the deaf children she encountered in their region. Word of her success with horse training and her role in saving Jake's children during the scarlet fever epidemic had spread throughout the county, and parents of deaf children began seeking her advice and assistance. Sarah's first student was a 7-year-old boy named Tommy, whose parents had traveled 3 days from their homestead near the New Mexico border. The child had never been exposed to sign language and had developed only the most basic gestures to communicate his needs. His parents were loving but desperate, having been told by various authorities that their son was unteachable and would never amount to anything more than a burden on their family. Working with Tommy revealed to Sarah the systematic educational neglect that deaf children faced throughout the frontier. Most had never been exposed to any formal language, either signed or written. They existed in intellectual isolation, unable to access the conversations, stories, and accumulated knowledge that hearing children absorbed naturally from their environment. Yet when Sarah began teaching Tommy sign language, his intelligence and curiosity became immediately apparent. Within weeks, Tommy was communicating complex ideas, asking questions about everything he observed, and demonstrating the same intellectual capacity as any hearing child his age. His transformation was so dramatic that his parents wept when they saw him engage in his first real conversation with another human being. Word of Tommy's progress spread rapidly through networks of families dealing with similar challenges. Soon, Sarah had 5 students, then 10, then 15. Parents were willing to travel enormous distances and make significant financial sacrifices to give their deaf children access to real education. Sarah found herself operating an informal school in the Morrison family's main room, using slates and handmade educational materials to teach reading, writing, mathematics, and practical skills alongside sign language. The growth of her student population forced Sarah to confront the limitations of informal education. She needed more space, more materials, trained assistants, and some form of official recognition that would give her school legitimacy and access to resources. Jake supported her vision completely, but they both recognized that establishing a formal institution would require resources, political connections, and expertise that neither of them possessed. Sarah's correspondence with deaf educators in established cities became more focused and urgent. She reached out to the American Asylum for Deaf Mutes in Hartford, Connecticut, seeking guidance on curriculum development, teacher training, and administrative organization. She wrote to successful deaf individuals in various professions, asking for advice on preparing her students for independent adult lives. These connections led to Sarah's first trip away from the ranch since her marriage. In the spring of 1886, she traveled to Austin to attend a conference on special education that had been organized by progressive legislators interested in expanding educational opportunities throughout Texas. The journey represented a huge step for Sarah, who had never traveled alone and had rarely been in situations where she was the only deaf person present. At the conference, Sarah presented her educational philosophy and methods to an audience of educators, politicians, and philanthropists. Her presentation, delivered through an interpreter but supplemented by demonstrations of sign language and examples of her students' work, challenged many assumptions about deaf people's capabilities. She argued that deaf children were not mentally deficient, but linguistically isolated, and that appropriate education could unlock intellectual potential that was equal to that of hearing children. The response to Sarah's presentation was overwhelmingly positive, leading to invitations to speak at additional conferences and connections with potential funding sources. More importantly, she met other educators who were working to advance deaf education and who could provide the expertise and support needed to transform her informal school into a proper institution. When Sarah's father appeared at their door years later, broken by alcohol and seeking forgiveness, she faced him with dignity earned through hard-won happiness. "You sold me like livestock," she signed, with Jake translating for the old man who'd never learned her language. "But you accidentally gave me to the one man who saw my value." Her father wept then, understanding finally what he'd lost when he chose desperation over love. Sarah forgave him because holding anger served no purpose, but she made it clear that her life had moved far beyond the limitations he'd once imposed upon it. As Sarah's influence grew throughout the region, she began corresponding with deaf communities in larger cities, sharing techniques and learning new approaches to education and advocacy. Her letters, carefully translated by Jake when necessary, reached educators in New York, doctors in Chicago, and pioneering deaf activists in Washington, D.C. These connections brought new ideas and resources to their small Texas community. The establishment of the Texas Institute for Deaf Education in 1887 represented the culmination of Sarah's transformation from discarded daughter to pioneering educator. The formal school, built on land donated by Jake and funded through a combination of state appropriations, private donations, and fundraising efforts, became the first institution of its kind in the Southwest, specifically designed to serve deaf students using sign language as the primary mode of instruction. Sarah's approach to deaf education was revolutionary for its time. While most institutions focused on teaching deaf students to speak and lip read in an attempt to make them appear as normal as possible, Sarah embraced sign language as a complete and sophisticated means of communication. She argued that forcing deaf children to struggle with oral communication was like forcing a gifted artist to paint only with their non-dominant hand, possible but wasteful of their natural talents and abilities. The Institute's curriculum included traditional academic subjects taught at a level that challenged students intellectually while providing practical skills that would enable them to support themselves as adults. Students learned carpentry, agriculture, sewing, cooking, and business skills alongside literature, mathematics, history, and science. Sarah insisted that her students be prepared not just to survive in a hearing world, but to contribute meaningfully to their communities. The success of Sarah's educational philosophy became evident in the achievements of her graduates. Former students became teachers, shopkeepers, skilled craftsmen, and farmers throughout Texas and the surrounding territories. They married, raised families, and participated fully in community life, disproving every stereotype about deaf people's limitations. Each success story brought more recognition to the Institute and more students seeking the transformative education that Sarah provided. But perhaps Sarah's greatest innovation was her approach to preparing hearing people to interact respectfully with deaf individuals. She required all hearing visitors to the Institute to learn basic sign language before touring the facilities. She organized community events where hearing and deaf families socialized together, breaking down barriers through direct interaction. She trained hearing teachers to work effectively with deaf students, creating a model for inclusive education that influenced schools throughout the region. The Institute also became a center for research and innovation in deaf education. Sarah collaborated with doctors, linguists, and other educators to study sign language, develop new teaching methods, and create educational materials specifically designed for visual learners. Her work contributed to a growing body of knowledge about deaf culture and education that influenced institutions throughout the United States. The personal cost of Sarah's professional success was significant. Running an institution required administrative skills, political navigation, and public speaking that pushed her far beyond her comfort zone. She had to learn to work with government officials, manage complex budgets, and advocate for her students in settings where she was often the only deaf person present. The stress of these responsibilities, combined with the physical demands of teaching and the emotional investment in her students' success, took a toll on her health that she often ignored in pursuit of her mission. Jake's support during these demanding years was unwavering, but came at a cost to their family life. He took on increasing responsibility for managing the ranch and caring for their children, while Sarah traveled, attended conferences, and devoted long hours to the Institute. Their marriage survived these pressures because both partners remained committed to their shared values and because they had built their relationship on mutual respect and genuine partnership rather than traditional gender roles. The Institute's growing reputation attracted attention from educators and advocates throughout the United States and even from international visitors interested in learning about innovative approaches to deaf education. Sarah found herself corresponding with deaf schools in Europe, sharing techniques and learning about different cultural approaches to deaf education. These international connections enriched her understanding of deaf culture and reinforced her belief that deaf people formed a distinct linguistic and cultural community that deserved respect and recognition. Her teaching methods revolutionized deaf education in the Southwest. Rather than forcing students to rely solely on lip reading and speech, Sarah embraced sign language as a complete and sophisticated means of communication. She proved that deaf students could master complex mathematical concepts, write poetry, understand history, and engage with literature when instruction was delivered in their natural language. The success of her students became legendary throughout Texas. Former students became teachers themselves, business owners, skilled craftsmen, and community leaders. They married, raised families, and contributed to their communities in ways that challenged every stereotype about deaf people's capabilities. Each success story reinforced Sarah's belief that society's expectations, not individual limitations, had been the primary barrier to deaf people's achievement. Jake supported every aspect of Sarah's educational mission, using his growing influence as a successful rancher to advocate for deaf rights at the state level. He testified before legislative committees, corresponded with government officials, and used his membership in cattlemen's associations to spread awareness about deaf people's potential contributions to society. His transformation from a man who had never considered disability issues to a passionate advocate inspired other hearing people to examine their own assumptions and prejudices. Jake supported every one of her endeavors, learning alongside her and using his influence as a successful rancher to open doors that might otherwise have remained closed. Their partnership became legendary. The cowboy who'd seen past society's prejudices and the deaf woman who'd transformed those prejudices into positive change. Their children grew up bilingual in spoken English and American Sign Language, becoming bridges between the hearing and deaf communities. Samuel became a teacher at Sarah's school. Maria married a doctor who specialized in treating hearing-related conditions. The younger boys chose various paths, but all carried forward the lessons of inclusion and respect their parents had taught them. Visitors to the Morrison Ranch often commented on the unusual but effective communication they witnessed there. Conversations flowed seamlessly between spoken words and sign language, with family members switching between methods as naturally as breathing. Mealtimes included both audible discussion and visual storytelling. Evening entertainment might feature music for the hearing members and elaborate shadow puppet shows that Sarah had perfected for everyone's enjoyment. When a railroad company approached Jake about selling his land for a new line, they were surprised by his response. Sarah had taught him that some things couldn't be bought or sold, that value came from roots and relationships rather than quick profits. "This land holds our story," he told them. "Every fence post, every building, every tree planted by my wife's hands. You can't put a price on that kind of history." Sarah's garden became a gathering place for people from all walks of life. Deaf children learned to tend vegetables while developing confidence in their abilities. Hearing neighbors discovered that communication went far beyond spoken words. Travelers stopped to rest and often left with new perspectives on what constituted normal or valuable in human interaction. As they aged together, Jake and Sarah faced the challenges that come to all couples who build lives together. Illness, financial pressures, the pain of watching children leave home to start families of their own. But they weathered these storms with the same patience and creativity that had marked their early years together. Jake's hearing began failing in his 70s, a development that brought unexpected gifts to their relationship. As he entered Sarah's silent world, he discovered new depths of visual beauty and tactile communication that he'd missed during his hearing years. Their conversations became even more intimate, conducted through touch and expression and the shared language they'd built over decades together. When Sarah passed away peacefully in her sleep at age 78, Jake found himself surrounded by the vast community she'd created. Deaf students who'd become teachers and professionals, hearing neighbors who'd learned sign language, children and grandchildren who carried forward her legacy of inclusion and respect. The church was filled with people communicating in every possible way: spoken words, sign language, written notes, and the simple presence that had always been Sarah's greatest gift. Jake lived 3 more years after Sarah's death, spending his time writing down their story and ensuring that the school and programs she'd established would continue. He wanted future generations to understand that love could transcend any barrier when people were willing to learn each other's languages, whether spoken, signed, or expressed through simple human kindness. They were buried side by side in the cemetery overlooking the valley where they'd built their life together. The headstone Jake commissioned bore inscriptions in both English and the sign language alphabet, ensuring that visitors from both communities could understand the love story it represented. Sarah's garden continued blooming long after her death, tended by students from her school and neighbors who'd learned her techniques. The vegetables she'd coaxed from stubborn soil became seeds for new gardens throughout the county. Her methods for working with horses spread to ranches across the West. Most importantly, her belief that everyone deserved to be heard, regardless of whether they could hear, became part of the cultural fabric of their community. Today, visitors to the site of the old Morrison Ranch can still see the foundation stones of the original house and the ancient oak tree that shaded Sarah's garden. A historical marker tells the story of the deaf woman who was sold like livestock, but who taught an entire community to value different forms of communication and connection. Local schools still teach about Jake and Sarah Morrison, the unlikely couple who proved that love could bridge any gap when people approached each other with respect and willingness to learn. Their story reminds us that society's limitations are often more disabling than any individual condition, and that real hearing has nothing to do with functional ears and everything to do with open hearts. In a world that too often sees differences as deficits, Jake and Sarah Morrison's love story stands as testimony to the transformative power of seeing people as they truly are, rather than as society says they should be. Sometimes the most important conversations happen without words, and sometimes the most beautiful voices are the ones that speak through actions, patience, and unconditional acceptance. Their legacy lives on in the countless lives they touched, the barriers they broke down, and the understanding that authentic communication requires not perfect hearing, but perfect willingness to listen with more than just our ears. In learning to hear Sarah, Jake taught an entire community what it really means to understand one another.